Hello and welcome everybody to our first online lecture. Unit 2.1 is a little different than the other units in this class. It is looking at the history of evolutionary science, and we do a little bit of just kind of history of science and biology also. Note about the assigned reading. I've posted a PDF of the entire text of Darwin's famous book, Origin of the Species. It's perhaps, arguably the most famous and influential book of science ever written. It is really critical. It's a long book. Don't freak out. You don't need to read it all, as you noticed in the title. I recommend a few pages just from the introduction, give you a little bit of background, and then about 10 or so pages that are from one of his chapters on natural selection. In the book, Darwin goes in a lot of detail about examples supporting his hypotheses and ideas about how species evolved and how they changed over time. And I just wanted you to get kind of a feel for his writing. If you're interested in it, you can read more. I won't ask you questions specifically from that reading, at least not ones that we don't cover in the lecture, but just that's how you should treat that reading. So, our Western civilization's history of science dates back to the ancient Greeks. There may have been people doing things similar before, but if so, their writings didn't survive. And a lot of what our society, our culture, even our government and political systems go all the way back to these traditions and governments that were founded by the ancient Greeks. We're just going to learn a couple names that you need to know, but there are a bunch of them. Like Empedocles was a early philosopher. He wrote about the nature of the world around him, elements. He's the one who came up with the idea of four basic elements, and this persisted for millennia. So it's the idea of we have earth, wind, or air, I guess, water, and fire. And he tried to use that to explain processes and things that he was seeing in the natural world around him. Later philosophers came along and actually Anaximanders a little bit before Empedocles, but around this time, the ancient Greek city-states, these philosophers began to talk about the world around them. And although it wasn't quite science like we would call it today, it was close. They would write down their experiments, their hypotheses. Sometimes they would test them, which would allow other people to double-check their work. And so really we have the roots of modern science in what the ancient Greeks were doing. Now, much of what they talked about and wrote about was very limited or even completely wrong. So Anaximander, for example, wrote about how the Earth was a disk covered in a bubble of air and clouds, as you can see here on the overhead, and that the stars were really holes in a large black sphere that surrounded the Earth, and there's a massive fire outside keeping everything warm. And so this matched superficially with what he was observing. But today, of course, with additional data and more technology to examine the world around us, we have a very, very different set of concepts and ideas about what's going on in nature. But I just want you to realize that our approach to the world around us, our scientific method, is founded in the philosophy of the ancient Greeks. I'm not going to ask you to remember or learn specifics about Anaximander or Empedocles. You don't need to worry about them. But this next scientist you do need to know. Aristotle is also known as the father of natural history, or maybe in some ways even the father of biology. He's perhaps the most famous of the Greek philosophers. He came out of the same school, and they were a mentor and mentee as Plato. And Plato had some other really important ideas that held sway in science and philosophy in general, but we're going to focus on Aristotle. So you need to know Aristotle, that he was an ancient Greek, and he came up with many ideas that were critical for the formation of what we today call biology. One of them, which is directly related to the theory of evolution, is this idea of classification. How do we organize and arrange living organisms into a system that helps us understand the world around us and helps us to make sense of what we see? Now, his idea, which was accepted and used for millennia, is called the scala natura. Now, that is a Latin term that goes back to the Greeks, and then the Romans who Latinized it and built upon what the Greeks had done and used much of what they did. If you know Spanish or any other Latin language, it can actually help you remember this. So scala is from the same root as escalar, which is ladder. So that first word means ladder, and of course the second word there is nature. So this literally is nature's ladder. And it's an arrangement, a very hierarchical arrangement. And so in this idea, the lowest, simplest living organisms would be at the bottom. Now, in Aristotle's time, they didn't have magnifying glasses or microscopes, and so they could see some very, very small things, but not down to the microscopic level. So they didn't know about single-celled organisms or about germs or anything like that. And so they would have put plants, very simple organisms, here at the bottom. Animals would have been larger. He's got fish above that, birds, and then finally he puts humans. And then, of course, this is actually from a later drawing. This isn't Aristotle's drawing, but someone using his idea. In many cultures, this idea was used to reinforce cultural values and cultural structures. So sometimes, as in this drawing, they would put some humans on one level and then other humans like the royalty or the aristocracy above that, and then God and his angels above that. So this was inextricably connected in many of these societies with religious practices, cultural traditions, and was largely unchallenged for hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay, so all through the Dark Ages into the Middle Ages, and people begin to now read the writings of the ancient Greeks and the Romans, and even to some extent people in the Middle East and other areas, and they begin to revive this idea of methodological naturalism, and it really starts to transform and become what we think of as modern science. So really some of the first scientists, we're looking back now in the 1700s, and these were people now that are doing science much like we do it today. They would have ideas, they would gather data or perform experiments, and then based on the results of those ideas, they would revise their initial hypotheses and then continue to work and write about it and communicate about it. Other people would work on it, and gradually bodies of knowledge begin to build up. One of which this is actually a geologist, two geologists actually that had very similar ideas, but plays a critical role because of what it tells us about the history of life on Earth. And also this idea that they had in geology can also be applied to non-geological processes when we're trying to infer past events. So this is an idea called uniformitarianism. And uniformitarianism is the idea that the fundamental laws of the universe do not change. So gravity, for instance, worked the same 100 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago. That principle of gravity, which is fundamental to how our universe works, is immutable and unchangeable. And so that could be said about the way that light works, or the way that cells divide, or the way that molecules interact with each other. No matter what it is, we have this idea that we can understand the past by making observations about what's going on today. And so, for instance, if you were able to measure rates of erosion, you could, based on the amount of water, the elevation change, the type of sediment that it's flowing to, estimate that how long it would take to carve a large canyon through rock. And so we can come up with estimates about the age of geological structures. How long does it take for sediment to form? How long does it take for sediment to be compacted into rock? And if we can observe these processes today, and depending on the amount of accuracy that we can observe them, we could make some pretty good extrapolations and ideas about what happened in the past. Now, Hutton and Lyell, these are two names that you need to know. So far we've got Aristotle, and now we have Hutton and Lyell, which are associated with this idea of uniformitarianism. And they wrote a very famous book and started talking about these. And again, they were interested in the context of geology. But this also has a very close connection to modern biology, and particularly paleontology, and how that connects in with our understanding of the history of life on Earth. Now, another idea that was common going again back to the 1700s, and this idea had persisted for hundreds of years before that, but it was an idea of spontaneous generation. And spontaneous generation is the idea that life readily occurs and is evolved de novo, meaning it arises from non-living material. So for instance, If you leave out meat, eventually you'll start to have maggots that are in the meat and flies that are coming out of that meat. And so the idea was that somehow the substance of that meat, the material that was in that meat, directly gave rise to the flies without any sort of egg or anything coming in. And so that meat could be transmogrified or changed directly into a fly. Okay. Now, as people began to examine these ideas more critically, as scientists came along, they realized that many of these ideas didn't pass the rigorous tests of experimental science. So, for instance, if you put a lid on meat and do the same experiment, you don't get any flies. And so then people would argue, oh, maybe there's something critical, some fundamental component of the air which is necessary for that process, which is, we realize that today, right? If you didn't have enough oxygen, then even if organisms were able to spontaneously generate from dead material, they would be unable to do so because they would need oxygen. So then people revise them, and this talks about experimental design and methods. And they say, okay, well, let's put a mesh over them and allow air to flow in, but not allow flies to get in. That even if, when we're not looking, so that we can ensure that there are no eggs laid on it. And sure enough, you run these experiments. Some of these are very similar to experiments that Louis Pasteur did, and he was one of the critical thinkers and researchers who disproved this idea of very frequent and common spontaneous generation. But from superficial observations, this may not be that far-fetched, right? So we can see turtles, coming up out of the sand, and unless you were there months before when the mother turtle had laid the nest, you might think that they were spontaneously generating from the sand. If you dig a hole or a pond, an area for holding water, in the back of your yard, then over time you would see that pond, that water, would fill up with life. Now, of course, we understand today that this is because wind is blowing in spores, or birds are coming in with dirt and mud on their feet and bringing in eggs and other material from far away. But it's really phenomenal how quickly life colonizes new areas and generates. And so it may not be that much of a stretch to think that this could be spontaneous generation, life arising from non-living material. Now today, of course, after many experiments and lots of gathering data, we know that this doesn't happen. And we'll talk about cell theory in a little bit here, but basically we know that all life on Earth today arises from the division of already living cells. And although spontaneous generation occurred early in the history of life on Earth, that has led to all life on Earth today, and it's not a common independent origin for different species. Now, before Darwin wrote his book on the origin of the species in the mid-1800s, there were lots and lots of ideas about evolution, and sometimes it was even called evolution. That word was used. And so Darwin was not the first person to come up with the idea of evolution. Sometimes he gets all the credit and I guess blame, depending on who you're talking to, for that idea. But evolution was not Darwin's idea. What was unique for Darwin was he was the first person to propose a hypothesis for a mechanism of how evolution occurs that has been supported and studied and was largely right about how that occurs, and we'll get to that in a bit. Okay, but there are other people who wrote about, for example, the struggle for existence, or that populations could change from one generation to the next, that species are adapted to their environment. So many of these ideas of evolution were there. They just were not put together in a way that explained the mechanisms of how it progressed. So people knew and understood that life could change, that populations varied over time, but they didn't exactly understand the processes that governed those changes. So, a little bit before Darwin, a man named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. So this is another name you need to know. We've got Aristotle, we've got Hutton and Lyell, and now Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And he was responsible for an early theory of the mechanisms of evolution. And he had two key ideas to his mechanisms of evolution. The first is that organisms can inherit acquired traits. Now, what does that mean exactly? So let me give you an example. Imagine that I go out and I exercise and I get in really great shape and put on all sorts of muscle, and then if I was to reproduce and have offspring after that, Lamarck would say that the offspring I had after doing that would have a better chance of being large and in shape and would be healthier because I was healthier when I had them. They would inherit that trait that I had acquired. On the other hand, if I was really out of shape or had other physical traits that I was expressing or carrying when I reproduced, my offspring would carry those traits. Now, today we know that it doesn't really work this way. There were actually people who experimented on this, and one of the early experiments that disproved this was an experiment with mice where they would chop the tails off of mice and then allow them to mate and reproduce. And they would have expected, if Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's theory was right, to then have generations of mice that either had no tails or markedly shorter tails. But that didn't happen. And today we know that our genes are not carried, that we pass on to our offspring, are not carried in the somatic cells. So even, for instance, cancer, if I get cancer, I have skin cancer, liver cancer, or whatever type of cancer, even if I reproduce after I've had this genetic change, because the genetic change is in my somatic cells, my body, and not my gametes, right? That those changes don't get passed down to the next generation. Okay, so it's only the germline, and we have to affect the germline to be able to have traits that are passed down to the next generation. And we'll talk about the mechanism for those changes. Well, we've already done it, right? So it's random mutation that causes those changes that then increase variation that can be passed down to the next generation. Okay, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's second major idea was that So a second major idea was that all species on Earth arose independently, that they were not related and connected to each other. And so this explained some of the things he observed in the natural world. I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit here. There we go. So on the left is Lamarck's idea of independent origin of each species, and his explanation for why some species were more complex than other species was that they had just been around longer, that all species started as simple, maybe even he would have said single cellular. By this time they had microscopes and understood the microscopic, at least to some extent, the microscopic part of life. And so complicated organisms had just had time to evolve and gain traits during their life that then were passed on to their offspring. And different organisms, because they were exposed to different environments, evolved differently. Now, there are a lot of some correct concepts in Lamarck's idea, but you should recognize that these two key concepts that he talked about, inheritance of acquired traits and the independent of all origin of all species, have largely been disproved. Now, there are some kind of small, we maybe call them an asterisk to one of these. So, for instance, epigenesis is a process that occurs in a small minority of cases where our physical environment can actually have an impact on the genes that we pass on to our offspring. And there's been some evidence of this, that under certain circumstances there's a small impact of our environment of our life onto our genes that we pass on to our offspring. But by and large, the vast majority of genetics is already pre-programmed into our cells, and the only way that things change is through random mutations that occur as DNA is being replicated. So by and large, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was wrong. These two ideas, which directly contradict Darwin's ideas, which we'll look at here in just a little bit, were later tested, experimented on, and disproven. So Darwin's, what he called his two great laws. The first is what we've already talked about, natural selection. And natural selection is a process that works on variability that is already present in a population, and based on the environment and what the environment dictates as being either a good or a bad trait, that will change a population. So for instance, if having longer legs is better than having shorter legs, and there's genetic variation in a population, then over time organisms with longer legs will have more babies, they'll be more successful, those genes will be passed on at greater frequency, and we end up with a distinct change in the species as a whole. Okay, so that's one of the key ideas, and we're going to spend much of the next discussion, next chapter, and the chapter even after that, looking at natural selection and going into the details of that. Darwin's other key principle for all life on Earth was common descent, which means that all species on Earth are related to each other. And we talked about this and already introduced this in the very first day of class, but this is a drawing from one of Darwin's notebooks, one of the earliest known phylogenies. And he drew it number 1 down here at the bottom, representing an ancestor for all life on Earth, and then major groups of animals diverging and evolving from that ancestor. Now you should recognize that these two great laws that Darwin wrote about are in direct opposition to Lamarck's ideas, right? So Lamarck would say, no, we don't act on variation that's already there and filter out what's there through some sort of a variational process. He would say that there is a transformational process based on the environment. So if you are working harder and getting bigger muscles, then you're going to pass those on to your offspring. Or if you are damaged and lose structures, then you would not be able to have those and pass those on to their offspring. But of course, as we understand modern genetics, that's not how it works. And then secondly, Lamarck had this idea of independent origin for all species, but Darwin said no, all species are connected together and they all come from a single common ancestor. Now, Darwin came up with these ideas, these two great laws, and all the other ideas that went into his theory of natural selection over a great many years. And there were a lot of forces that impacted that. He was an expert in numerous areas, especially he was a specialist in barnacles. He, as many scientists at the time did, though, was quite diverse and worked on many, many different areas of biology. One of the events of his life that had a great impact on his ideas was the time that he spent as a naturalist on one of the great British ships of exploration. So at the time, Britain was a great colonial power. They had colonies all over the world, and there was also many parts of the world that were still wilderness and unknown to Europeans. And so they would go about and they would explore new areas. Darwin was hired to be a naturalist on one of these ships of exploration, and his job was basically at ports of call where they would put their anchor down, and he'd take a boat to shore, and he would go and he would collect plants and animals, and he would preserve them and later prepare them and stuff them and save them so he could take them back to England and where he or other scientists could study them. The ship that he was on was called the HMS Beagle, and it circumnavigated the globe. So they sailed from England down to the coast of Africa, and then crossed over to South America and made various stops along the east coast of South America. They then made stops along the west coast of South America and then in the Galapagos Islands. These two stops were particularly important for Darwin. In Chile, along the what is now Chile at least, he observed the impact of a very recent major earthquake, and that earthquake was so massive that it raised the seabed there on the coast a few centimeters up. And he saw that, and he asked about the frequency of these earthquakes and realized they were fairly rare events, at least earthquakes that strong. And then as he walked up in the hills there leading up in the coastal range along the west coast of South America, he found fossil deposits of marine organisms. And he realized that this process had been going on for a very, very long time. And from that was able to extrapolate and know the idea that the Earth was very, very ancient, that in order for these mountains to build to the thousands of feet they were, that they would need millions of years to do that. And so it gave him some ideas about how old the Earth was. And these ideas had been debated and were not unique to Darwin, but his experiences there helped reinforce and helped convince him that this idea of a very ancient Earth, at least millions of years old rather than thousands of years old, was a better supported idea. And then, of course, perhaps most famously, there was a stop in the Galapagos Islands. And on the Galapagos Islands, Darwin saw all sorts of unique flora and fauna. He collected much of it, preserved it, took it back to England. Some very famous things like, of course, the giant tortoises that were there that were similar to things on the South American continent, but much, much larger and very obviously different species. And then a whole series of finches, which are also now very famous. That was the picture from the beginning slide in this discussion. And Darwin was not an expert in birds, and he did not immediately recognize them all as finches, which are small seed-eating birds on the continents. But on the Galapagos Islands, these finches had diverged into many, many groups. And so, in fact, there was a good deal of convergence. And some of the species of finches looked like more like a parrot or like a larger bird that would crush big nuts rather than eating little seeds, and some of them had beaks that had been modified for eating insects, which is unusual among the finches. But because the finches were in an environment where there was not much competition, they had less pressure to stay specialized in their niche that they fulfilled on the mainland, and were able to diversify into many, many groups, but they still maintained that inherent finch quality. Darwin didn't realize this until he took the specimens back to England and had an expert look at them. And so he began to, through all of these experiences and others as they completed their circumnavigation around the globe, hit the coast of South America again, and then went back to England. All the experiences he's had along the way informed and helped him to revise and come up with ideas about evolution. And so for the next couple of decades, he wrote, they had 20 years or so, he wrote about these ideas and refined them, and he gave them to friends and worked on them and continued to write and revise this great manuscript. And eventually this manuscript would go on to be published as The Origin of the Species in 1859. But he really dragged his feet. Some of that was because he was meticulous. He wanted to have lots of good content and arguments and wanted to make sure everything was organized. But a lot of it was also he realized that it was a controversial subject, that it was not going to be accepted by large portions of society, and even among the scientific community there was going to be debate. And I don't know that he was so worried about the scientific community, but he knew it would cause an uproar in the general population. And so many of the ideas in his book relied not only on natural observations, but also on observations amongst captive breeding programs. So at the time it was very popular to keep pigeons, and many, many different breeds of pigeons had been derived from the very common, what we call the common pigeon. It's also known as the rock dove. And so there are different varieties, and these are still around today. Here are pictures of some of them. But pigeon breeding is not as popular as it was back in Darwin's day. But it provided evidence that they could take variation that was present in a natural population, the pigeons, and with very focused selective breeding, you could have very, very different looking breeds within this one species. And he talked about other wild examples. He talked about dogs arising from wolves and had many, many ideas. And so he wrote these and wrote them up and talked about them and debated about them and refined them for 2 decades. After doing all of this, he received a letter from a man named Alfred Wallace. And Alfred Wallace was a naturalist who was working in Southeast Asia. He was not nearly as wealthy as Darwin. Most scientists in Darwin's day did not support themselves as scientists. They didn't have a job as a scientist. They had money from their family, and then they would just do science almost as I don't know if a hobby is the right word, because it really was their vocation, their life's work, but they weren't paid for it. And so there were a limited number of people that could actually do that. Wallace was not one of those. He was not wealthy and didn't have enough money to support himself. And so what he would do is he would go on these exploratory trips, and he would collect organisms and things that were rare or that were beautiful. He would preserve them and ship them back to England and sell them. And that's how he supported himself. And that was a well-established practice at the time. Today we'd kind of look at it and say, well, that's exploiting the ecosystem and probably not a very good thing to do. But at the time it was just kind of the way that scientists worked. And as he was doing this, he made many of the same observations that Darwin had. And so he wrote a letter to Darwin where he essentially outlined these ideas of common descent and the idea of a natural selection. And Darwin, when he read it, was kind of crestfallen and thought, oh, I've done all this work for decades, and now this man is going to get credit for this idea. Darwin's friends at the time said, no, you really deserve credit. You've been working on this for so long. And so Darwin kind of hurried up and finished writing his book and got it published while Wallace was still working in Southeast Asia. And Wallace was never really too bitter about it. He came up with the idea independently and really deserves credit for the idea in addition to Darwin, although Wallace is nowhere near as famous. But for this class, you should recognize Darwin. We'll talk more about natural selection and common ancestry here as we move forward. But you should also recognize that Alfred Wallace had the same idea and should get some credit for the ideas of natural selection also. One of the other major philosophical contributions to the idea of natural selection was from a man who was not a biologist, but he was quite well known and famous, and at this time, much more so than today, scientists of all different kinds would discuss ideas really outside of their realm and would read quite widely the books and writings of people that were in very distantly related fields. And so Darwin read and was quite taken with the ideas of Thomas Malthus. Um, but Thomas Malthus was not a biologist. He was basically what today we'd probably call a social scientist. He studied human populations, things like famine and war, the rise and fall of governments, disease, and things like that. And so in this process, he made this observation and wrote about this idea that the power of populations to grow is exponential. So, for instance, you can have two rabbits if they can have two babies, uh, or four babies. The amount that they can have then would would dictate the rate of the exponential growth. But you go 2, 4, 16, and or 2, 4, 8, 16, or however that exponential growth is, and very quickly you can get at extremely massive numbers. And so he was writing in the context of the human population. He said that human population growth is always going to be higher. It's going to outstrip the resources that we have, whether we're looking at space or food or our ability to get rid of toxins and waste, that there's a limit to how many individuals can be supported in a finite space. And so his interest was how that led to famine and conflict and maybe overthrow of governments, and how that could potentially be predicted or avoided. And so that was his area of interest. But when Darwin read this, he realized that it not only applied to humans, but to all sexually reproducing species, that they could have a exponential growth, and some do it much faster than others. So rabbits are going to grow exponentially much faster than, say, elephants, but elephants, given enough time, have the potential to produce way more offspring than can be supported by the environment. And so the inevitable outcome is that not all species are going to survive, and not all species are going to be equally represented in the following generations. And so this was a key insight for Darwin and led him to this idea of natural selection, that some reproduce, survive, and leave behind a higher percentage of their offspring in the population, and that could over time drastically change a population. Now, in real life situations, this of course is not always this neat. We might have years where organisms reproduce very, very well, nearly exponentially, maybe even for several years in a row, and then have a great crash in the population because of a famine or a disease or some other change in the environment. And that food supplies also are not simply static, that some years are better than others. We might have, for instance, rabbits after a year that had a very wet spring and there's lots of foraging for them, that we'd have a much higher available carrying capacity for the environment, which is the term that's used for how many species and how much of each species can fit into an environment. And so that can change. However, the ideas still hold up, that food supply and other necessary things for survival of a population are finite. Again, whether it's space or getting rid of toxins and refuse, things that garbage basically that's hanging around. Whatever it is, we have a limited carrying capacity for an environment, and it might go up and down from generations to generation or year to year, but it's still not going to be infinite. However, population growth, because it can grow exponentially, has the power to be essentially infinite if it continues unchecked. Now, of course, when population size reaches this limit, again, space, food supply, getting rid of toxins, whatever it might be, when it reaches that limit, you're going to have death among the population. Eventually, the population will level off at whatever the capacity is for it in the environment. And so we never get true, at least not for long periods of time, true exponential growth in natural populations. You can see this when you raise bacteria in a flask. We start off with a single bacterium, and over time we're going to double, every 20, 30 minutes if conditions are just right. And eventually we get to so many bacteria in that vial, that flask, that they can no longer add more and still survive. And so we reach a level of carrying capacity. And so again, Malthus was interested in what happened in human populations when this limit was reached, but Darwin was looking at natural selection across all species. Now, was Thomas Malthus correct? And the short answer is yes. His ideas about carrying capacity of environments was right. There's a finite limit to resources. Even if we take the globe as a whole, that's still a finite limit. And Malthus was really worried that fairly soon, because this was in the kind of beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, modern medicine was beginning to be used, ideas about sanitation and disease control were coming into play, and populations were exploding in many parts of the world and doing really well. And so Thomas Malthus was concerned about what would be the political and cultural impact of those things. And if we look at human population going back 200 years or so, back to the time of Darwin and Thomas Malthus, we essentially, in most areas of the world, have experienced exponential growth. Now, in modern industrialized countries, that exponential growth has largely flattened out. In fact, many countries, Italy, Japan, many other countries in Europe, and even America, have reached a point of stable population growth, meaning that we're having enough offspring to replace individuals that die, but not much more. And in many countries, there's actually a negative population growth if you only look at reproduction. Immigration also, of course, plays a role there too. And so if you have lots of immigrants coming in, the population as a whole will be continuing to rise, despite overall birth rates not being high enough to replace individuals in the population. And America, actually for about the last 30 years, has been at essentially, as far as birth rates go, a zero population growth country. But we've had lots and lots of immigration, and so we continue to grow, although not at the rate that we would have if birth rates had continued to stay at the levels they were through the early 20th century. Okay, so populations of humans have essentially grown exponentially, although there has been some self-checking of this in modern countries. But for instance, in India, in Indonesia, in many areas, we really see a clear, especially over the last 50 to 100 years, sign of this exponential population growth. Okay, so if populations have grown exponentially, why haven't we yet reached this crisis point? We have nearly 8 billion people living on the earth, many, many more than at any time in history. But yet we still have enough food to support all these people. Now, there are local famines, deficits of food and other resources, but typically those are short-term and regional or are due to political processes. Overall, we make way more than enough food to support all people on Earth. In fact, most of us have the luxury of picking what we eat and have so much food that we have to be careful that we don't gain excess weight. And so, even though Thomas Malthus was right, we have not yet reached this crisis point. Now, the reason for this is because of a man named Norman Borlaug. Norman Borlaug was a person who studied agriculture and the efficient methods of growing crops. And he and many others, but he's perhaps the most important contributing scientist to something that we call the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution is a dramatic change in how we raise our crops. It allows us to, through crop rotation, through the application of pesticides, through modern fertilization techniques, we can dramatically increase the yield of arable land, that land where we plant rice or wheat or corn or soybeans, which are a huge chunk of the calories. In fact, about 50% of all the calories that humans consume comes from one of those four crops. And so we've been able to dramatically increase the yield and keep up with human population growth. Now, whether or not that will continue is still an open question. We have a lot of space and a lot of room to continue to improve our land usage, our water usage, the way that we rotate crops. We can still dramatically increase our food production. However, many of the processes, not just in agriculture, but also in, say, fishing or in ranching, in other ways that we use to support the human race, they are long-term unsustainable because we're impacting the environment. We are depleting fishing stocks in many areas. They're not managed as well as they could be. And so people are looking at that, researching it, and trying to find a way to sustainably harvest from the ocean and not have a long-term impact. And of course, as populations continue to grow larger and larger and larger, there's going to be more and more pressure and more regional strife and droughts and famines that are affecting parts of the world. So, take-home message. You need to know Thomas Malthus, know his contribution to evolution. You need to know Norman Borlaug, and know that Norman Borlaug was a critical, perhaps the most, he's probably, if we look at what his research and his research programs have helped to generate, has probably saved more lives than maybe any other person on earth, because millions and millions of people would have potentially have starved to death if we had not had the advances that were pioneered by him and other researchers in this. So just be aware of him and his importance in that, the role that he plays there. Okay, so again, Darwin's ideas of common descent have now been well supported, lots and lots of data and evidence from the fossil record, from phylogenies based on DNA and genetic evidence, from observations that we make in species today. All life on Earth is very well established to have come from a single common ancestor. And so this idea of independent origin of life has been refuted. Lamarck was wrong, right? And Darwin got it right. The reason organisms are simple is not because they have not been around for a very long time. It's because that those organisms are adapted and fit those niches where single-cell organisms do really, really well. While other organisms that may have started out as single-cellular have adapted to different, more complicated life cycles and lifestyles. And so all the species we see on Earth today do share a common ancestor, and some of them are more complex than others because they have just been that section of the population that has adapted and speciated and filled up those niches that allow for those more complex interactions. And so a quick review. We've already talked about these things before, but taxonomy, classification, and phylogenetics, all three of those are scientific disciplines that we can put under the umbrella category of systematics. And sometimes you'll even see it referred to as phylogenetic systematics. But realize they really need one another, and they work together to help us understand evolution and provide roadmaps for studying evolution. And we spent a long time talking about phylogenetics, so you know the other two also, but let's just quickly review. Phylogenetics is, of course, understanding the relationships among different species, and we do analyses and then use trees to represent those hypotheses, and then we may revise them as we gather new data. So that's phylogenetics. Once we have our phylogenies, we use them to inform our classification and our taxonomy. So classification simply refers to putting organisms into these hierarchical groups that we've talked about. And in Bio 1, you learn those hierarchies. You don't need to have them memorized, but you learn about kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Today we understand that the kingdoms as they were originally defined are not really valid, and so you might learn about domains instead of kingdoms or both. But that's a simple classification based on our understanding of the interconnections of those species. And then of course taxonomy is simply the names that we give to those larger classified groups, and the names that we give are the binomial nomenclature, right? These two-part names that we give to species. So just be aware of those three and notice that we need them, that we can't do phylogenetics unless we have groups to start to work on, and then we revise them, and there's kind of this circular process that is ongoing and continues to revise our understanding of groups. Okay. Now, during Darwin's life, and even after, there were multiple quote-unquote problems with his ideas. These were things that people brought up that did not seem to fit well with their understanding of the way that the world worked. Now, most of them have, well, all of them have been resolved to one extent or another. Some are still being worked on, and specific examples of some of these problems are still not well understood. But by and large, these have largely been worked out. So we'll point them out, and we'll talk about the things that helped us to understand how these maybe weren't as big a problem as we thought. Okay? So, number one is the one that people continue to look at and study and examine, especially when they're looking at very specific instances of this. And this is the idea of very, very complicated structures. So for example, the vertebrate eye is a complicated structure that's made up of a lens, of muscles, of nerves, of connective tissue, all of these things together that have to work together in concert to create a functional eye. And so the argument at the time was that the call was, what is good as half an eye? And so Darwin's idea was that little tiny variations would result in different natural selection on parts of the population. You have small changes, and over many years, these little tiny steps would all build up to major differences. And so the idea was that if you have a mutation that gives you a little bit better eye, or a structure that's there but not integrated into the eye as a whole, it might not be an overall advantage, and so shouldn't be selected for. And so this led to a lot of work, a lot of research, people reevaluating fossils. And for some groups, like for instance the molluscae, we actually have a pretty good idea of many of the transitional features that occur along the timeline leading to the modern complicated molluscae that we see in like octopus and squid. For the vertebrate eye, which is equally complicated and in some ways very different from the molluscae, we don't have those intermediate steps. We don't have species alive that still have the early primitive vertebrate eye, like we have species like clams or scallops, even snails that have an early primitive version of the molluscae. They still have it today, and we see the more advanced form in octopus and squid. So some of them we don't have. Others we've got pretty good now evidence from the fossil record, where we see the origin of complicated structures such as the wings in birds that are recorded in the fossil record starting early in the origin of those groups and extending to modern species. So again, this was a problem. Many of it has been solved, but people are still going and experimenting on different examples and trying to figure out how we get to some of these complex features. Second, this one was fairly easily dismissed early on, but this is the idea of organs and traits that don't have any sort of real importance. So we might look at vestigial traits, or we might look at something like hair color or blood type, where there's lots of variation, but it doesn't really seem that one of them gives advantage over the other. So in Darwin's day, everything was looked at as a natural selective advantage. If you had a feature that was good, it would become more common and eventually would be the only feature in the population. We'd lose all the other versions of that were not as good. And so people did not understand why we might have a trait that seemed to be useless, that natural selection should have removed it over time. Now today we know that much of evolution is effectively neutral. And we'll talk about that later on, and what are some of the forces that cause things to be effectively neutral. But by and large, this idea has been explained. And then finally, because of a misunderstanding, or rather a lack of understanding about genetics and how genes were passed on from one generation to the next during Darwin's time, the idea of natural selection led to the natural extension that we should have almost no variability in the population, right? So remember, natural selection, as Darwin outlined it, is a variational process. And variational processes inevitably reduce the diversity of a population. And so because they didn't understand genetics, they didn't understand mutation and its role in increasing diversity, people looked at Darwin's idea and said, hey, this can't be right, because we see lots of diversity in populations, but if natural selection had been working for these millions of years, we should see very, very low levels of diversity, or no diversity at all. Everyone should be essentially the same. Yet that's not what we observe. And so although Darwin was unable to refute this idea in his time because he didn't have the understanding, he still was very confident and sure that his idea of natural selection was right, despite not being able to resolve these problems during his lifespan. All right, so a couple of quick names and the contribution that they had to evolutionary thought and to science in general that you need to know. The first is August Weismann, and there are other people that worked in this area also that are close, but August Weismann was one of the earliest and most influential, so we'll learn him. And he in many ways was the father of what today we call germ theory or germplasm theory. And this is the idea that all cells on Earth are the result of divisions of already living cells. So essentially we don't have spontaneous generation going on all the time. So germ theory has one other key major fundamental part of it, which is that all living organisms are made up of cells. Cells are a fundamental need component of life. You can have a single cell and have a living organism, or many cells together, but all living things are cellular. And not only that, but the cells that we pass on either through meiosis and fusion of gametes to make a new organism or by mitosis, all the cells are the result of cellular division from other cells. Okay? So that was August Weismann's idea, and you should recognize that this idea directly refutes and contradicts Lamarck's idea of common spontaneous generation. And then finally, Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was a contemporary of Darwin. He was born a little bit later, but was working at much of the same time that Darwin was doing his work. And Gregor Mendel was doing work that was decades ahead of his time. You learn about him in Bio 1. We won't go into a whole lot of detail, but essentially doing very, very careful and meticulous crossbreeding experiments in pea plants, Darwin was able to figure out the mechanisms of genetic inheritance. And I expect that if you're in this class, you understand the basics of that Bio 1 level understanding. And we'll look at Punnett squares and review a few little concepts here and there, but you need to understand the way that genetics works. Before Mendel, the main idea about how traits were passed on from one generation to the next was something similar to what we might call a blended trait or blended inheritance. And this is the idea that, I thought I had a slide there. I guess we'll do that later. But the idea of blended inheritance is something like paint. Imagine that as an analogy. If you had two colors of paint and you mix them together, you get something in between. So you mixed red and white and you end up with a pink color. And so that was the mechanism of how two parents got together, made an offspring, that the offspring would be some combination of the parents, and would be a unique third thing that was half mom and half dad. Okay. Now, at the cellular level, we realize today, and Mendel figured this out, that that's not what happened. Really, it's not like mixing paint and making a unique third product. It's really more like mixing two marbles. You get a marble from mom, a marble from dad. They get together and they don't become some fused third marble. They stay unique and separate, right? So we have two alleles, one from mom and one from dad. We can pass those on unchanged, or if there's a new mutation, maybe with a slight modification, but they don't mix together like paint. And so this is the idea of particulate inheritance, or as Mendel called these things, genes, right? So a gene is a unique, distinct location on a chromosome, and different versions of genes that can be passed on to offspring are called alleles. Now, this was groundbreaking, revolutionary. As I said, Mendel was decades ahead of his time. However, he went largely unrecognized. His contributions to science were not given value, and until they were quote-unquote rediscovered decades later, almost 80 years later, when they were really rediscovered and began to be applied beyond just his pea plants, people realized how valuable it was in helping them understand genetics. It wasn't until then that he began to get credit for his work. And so Darwin didn't know about Mendel and didn't know about this idea of inheritance, and so it would have helped to have solved some of the problems we talked about earlier, particularly this one with the loss of variation in populations, which Mendelian genetics helps to explain part of that, because we don't just simply fuse together things and end up with everyone being roughly the same. And also this idea of traits and organs of little importance. To some extent, if we look at recessive and dominance and those sorts of things, that can help to explain why we might have traits that are not optimal. That's one of the reasons why they can stay in populations for very, very long times. Okay. Now, after Darwin and after Mendel, moving into the 20th century, we have dozens and dozens and dozens of researchers, some that contributed and originated entire fields within evolutionary biology. I'm not going to have you learn any of their names, okay? So you might see them pop up once in a while. Fisher, Sewell, just having a mental break or a mental blank here, but Wright, Haldane. So there are a lot of them. You don't need to know any of their names, but altogether, people during the 20th century rediscovering Mendel's ideas, taking the work that Darwin had initiated and had been worked on for 50 or 60 years, and they put those things together and make modern evolutionary biology. And this time period is referred to as the modern synthesis. So lots of workers helping to contribute and increase our understanding of evolutionary biology. And so they were able to do things like unify natural selection and Mendelian genetics. They were able to discover and understand the role of mutation and the variation that it brings into natural populations. They understood and helped to explain why sexual reproduction is so advantageous, and we'll look at that in a later chapter. Polygeny, which is defined as a trait that's impacted by many, many different genes. And so Mendel focused on fairly simple traits where one gene with two alleles had an impact on a trait and he could measure it very easily. But realize that's a simplification for most genes. Most genes are much more complicated. And so, for instance, your height is not just determined by one gene with two or three alleles. It's determined by many other genes also all acting together to have an impact on how tall you're going to be. And so that's polygeny. And then finally, of course, genotype versus phenotype. How much of our traits are determined by our ancestry, by the genes we get from our parents, and how much of it is determined by our environment. And we can figure that out if we have a fundamental, solid understanding of the genetics that underlie these systems. Okay, that's the end of chapter 2.1. It's a little shorter than most chapters, a little bit different because we're looking at history and contributors to the field of biology. Just a quick reminder, this lecture is for Monday, January 22nd. There is also a quiz that will post, or if you're listening to this on Monday, has already posted, but it posts early on Monday. It's available all day Monday and through the end of the day on Tuesday, July 23rd. So you need to take it by midnight on July 23rd. But it's only over this lecture, just over Unit 2.1. The other thing to keep an eye on is the worksheet. It's posted. I will post a separate instructional video with some help on how to do the worksheet. So just keep an eye on that. Remember that that's due on Thursday. You hand it in through Blackboard and submit it that way. So by end of the day, Thursday. So other than that, I'll see you here again tomorrow for lecture number 2.2. If you have any questions or need to review anything, reach out to me and send me an email, and I'll keep an eye out for those.